Morning, good morning. I'm going to wait for a few of you to join. I had some technical difficulties this morning, so I'm going to give a few minutes for those of you to join. This morning, Real Talk with Senator Rosalind Osgood is focused on this whole opposition to DEI. Why does the MAGA movement resist diversity, equity, and inclusion? And social emotional learning. This whole argument is deeply rooted in its broader culture war against what MAGA sees as left wing ideological control over institutions. So we have this whole war on this battle against woke or DE programs that were initially designed to increase representation and equal opportunity for historically marginalized groups like blacks and women's and Hispanic and veterans. And so mega conservatives argue that these initiatives have overstepped their goal or their original intent and now serves as a measure of control. Conservatives argue that diversity, equity, and inclusion replaces merit-based hiring and admissions with race and gender quotas, which leads to lower standards or unfair advantages for certain groups. In other words, they argue that diversity, equity, and inclusion leads to hiring people that are less qualified. So they see diversity, equity, and inclusion as a direct attack on the idea that success should be based on individual achievement rather than identity. So what we have is we have this group of white male privileged individuals who have enjoyed and benefited from their privilege and their power for all these years. And now they feel threatened when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. They feel like we are practicing reverse discrimination or creating this whole anti white movement. They believe that it involves discrimination against white people, particularly white men, and they point to hiring policies, college admissions, and corporate diversity training that, in their view, unfairly disadvantage white applicants and employees. They believe that DEI policies often include discussions about systemic racism, unconscious bias, and privilege. And the MAGA movement argues that these concepts are rooted in the critical race theory or Marxist ideology, which they believe demonize Western history and culture. So, in other words, when we talk about the systemic racism, that is true, that's in policies. I don't believe that all white people are racist, but I do believe that when our country was founded, it was founded by a group of elite white men who wrote the Constitution, and the Constitution was written to bring forth their ideas and concepts of a nation. And I make my argument based on the fact that we had to have an amendment to get women's rights to vote, blacks' rights to vote. Blacks were not even considered a unit or a person. So they set up this constitution or these ideas of America or what should govern us as a nation, but it was not inclusive of all people. And that's why we have DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have to talk about race. We have to talk about unconscious biases and privilege. I believe that we all have unconscious bias. And I believe that there are those, particularly white elite men, that have privilege and that have benefited from systemic racism or the racism that is in the systems or institutions that we need to live from day to day. So the conservative agenda is to take action against DEI, where you see a lot of state level bans where, several Republican led states, including Florida and Texas, have banned DEI programs in public universities and government agencies. They have this war on DEI. They've put, many corporations under pressure about DEI policies and hiring and making sure that there's diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. There's also been an attack on what we call as social emotional learning, which is programs in our schools that focus on helping students with develop emotional intelligence and empathy and resilience and interpersonal skills. And this social emotional learning has been adopted by many school districts and has gotten great results. But the MAGA movement and conservative view social emotional learning as a method of pushing progressive social values onto children. They say that social emotional learning is this type of psychological indoctrination. And they say that it encourages teachers to act as therapists rather than educators, pushing values based on learning that may conflict with parents' belief. So you have this war on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we need to understand is the major impact that this whole war on diversity, equity, and inclusion has on us as a society. It kind of creates this major culture war as MAGA shows this opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion and social emotional learning. It's part of a larger effort to resist what MAGA sees as growing influence of progressive ideology in schools, workplaces, and government. So this is it's a broad narrative, and I don't have time this morning to get into all the aspects of it, but I think it's very important that we understand the pushback against DEI and social emotional learning, and that MAGA says that it threatens traditional American values. So my question would be, what are those American values? Those values were sold to us in a constitution that there will be life, liberty, and justice for all. But at the time the Constitution was written, all didn't include each and every one of us. And now that we live in such a broader society that is so diverse, we see a lot of conflict going on. We have research that show us that when we have diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we have policies in place that promote a diverse workplace, and we deal with our different differences in a way that we embrace each other, it reduces our unconscious biases. When we have hiring practices that are inclusive, diversity, equity, inclusion does not mean that you're hiring someone that's less qualified. As an African American woman, I am female and I am black. So when we have these anti-DEI policies, it hits me in two places. But yet I can go work a job, and a white male counterpart who's less qualified will oftentimes make more money in that same job than I make. When you are a minority, you always have to work twice as hard and do twice the work just to kind of be seen as equal to somebody that's actually doing less work. It would be interesting if we would come together and kind of meet in the middle. I get the argument. If I was an elite white man that has benefited from privilege and power all my life, I could be threatened by diversity, equity, and inclusion because it appears that it would diminish or take away my power. And I think those of us that are not in the white male group would argue that we just want access to the power. We just want access to the privilege. So how do we meet in the middle and we balance it out for all of us? I think if we could agree that we would have zero tolerance for policies that or practices rather that discriminate against some so others can benefit, then we would be at a better place. But that's just not the reality of where we live and what we live in today. When we think about leadership training and development, a lot of that is shaped by the perspective of whatever philosophy a person or whatever core values a person have. And I think that when you live in a place like America and you're not in the elite white group, there is what I call a value gap, that you are valued less. That's why we continue to make public policy based on the end user. And you hear me talk about substance use disorder disease a lot because I'm a person that's in recovery for 35 years. And substance use disorder is the only disease that is criminalized. If you have cancer, any other disease, you go and you get treatment for it. But we can clearly see policy designed around substance use disorder to target the end user. The poor the population is that use a certain type of drug like crack, the stricter the penalty or the consequence or the punitive punishment is. You can use 5 grams of crack compared to 500 grams of cocaine and get two totally different sentences. In that situation where you see the amount of drugs is very different, but the penalty, you get 5 to 10 years for 5 grams of cocaine and 5 to 10 years for 500 grams of, I'm sorry, 5 to 10 years for 5 grams of crack and 5 to 10 years for 5 grams of cocaine. And now when opioid comes on the scene, we treat it as a health issue. And it's all based around the end users. I think if we could come to a moment of truth and look at data shows us that this nation has continued to have major disparities when it comes to minority groups, blacks, women's, veterans. So now we have all of these policies and these practices and this mandate for leadership that's laid out in Project 2025 to eliminate the Department of Education, to eliminate the Department of Veterans Affairs. And the thought is they would kind of just give the money to the state, and then the state can choose to opt in or out federal programs and keep the money. I think that there is a lot of research that supports the benefit of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but white people think that we use diversity, equity, and inclusion and social emotional learning to discriminate against them or to make them racist or to hurt them and harm them. And that's not true. What we're saying is we just want equal access and equal opportunities, the same privilege, the same power that they've been allowed to benefit from. We just want the same benefits. And that's how we have life, liberty, and justice for all. And I'm so glad this morning to see my dear friend Patricia West, who is just an awesome woman. Commissioner Diane Cox, good morning to you this morning. Good morning to Dr. D. Thompson. Good morning to you, Mr. Brown. Thank you for joining me this morning for Real Talk as we begin to have honest conversations. So what I need, when you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I need you to understand that the largest benefactors of diversity, equity, and inclusion is white women. They benefit from more C-suite jobs. They benefit from more government contracts. Our veterans is another population. Most things we do, there's a box you check if you've been in the military, if you are a veteran. And I think they should have that preferential treatment. And a shout out to all of you that have served in our military that made the sacrifice to protect us. So DEI is not just a black issue. It will have major impact on us as citizens, as Americans, as those that are living in the United States, if we don't take a stand and begin to have real talk and real conversations about the importance of having a diverse workplace, about the importance of equity. And equity doesn't mean equal. Equity means that we put the greatest resources to focus on the greatest needs. In inclusion, how do we live in a world that includes all of us? How do we make policies with all of our diverse perspectives that's going to benefit all of us? We do it by operating in a measure of collective excellence. We have to get ourselves individually to a place where we want the same liberty and freedoms for everybody else that we feel that we deserve for ourselves. So I want to challenge you this morning. Go out and do your research and study, but look at the mega position about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The world is blackening and browning, and I can understand people that have enjoyed privilege and power for hundreds and hundreds of years. I can understand them feeling threatened. I can even understand them feeling like they're being discriminated against. I'm black, so I know what it feels like to be discriminated against. But that's not my intention or our intention when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's our fight for equal access and equal opportunity. So let's continue to have real conversations. Talk to people that don't look like you. Talk to people that are part of the MAGA movement. Talk to conservative individuals to hear their perspective and share your perspective. I believe that it's in our dialogue, in our courageous conversations, that we understand each other better. If you are a policymaker, you have an obligation to make policy to lift all people and not make policy to help some and to hurt others. So when we have this agenda to change policies to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion, it gives this notion that we're not concerned about a diverse workplace. And I know as a woman, it has been very hard for us to get into leadership positions, and in some arenas, we're still seen as second class citizens. We can go to school, we can get degrees, we can learn a trade, we can do all of those things through a traditional process, but come out on the end with all the degrees and certifications and still be less valued as a white male counterpart. So as we continue to have these talks, let's continue to grow in our perspective. Let's pray for each other that we want the same thing for our neighbors. And remember, we don't get to choose our neighbors, that we want for ourselves. I ask you this morning, what is your unconscious bias? I believe we all have them. I don't do well with people that don't do the work, people that, just want positions, but they don't want to go through the process, people that are kind of lazy. But I'm working on that. Some people are blessed through connections, that they get opportunities through the connections and people that they know. They might not have to go through all the formal processes. But how do we move beyond our biases, that we really, really create a nation where all of us are valued? As a person of faith, sin keeps us all at an equilibrium, right? With God, there's no big eyes or little U's. God loves us all equally. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for Real Talk. Thank you to Kimberly. I see you this morning. I see you, my dear church member, Miss Belinda Sears. I see you, Dr. Elizabeth Jackson. But please, 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 when you talk about DEI, it is not just something that removing it will impact black people. It will have a major impact on our economy. All kinds of research and data show that workplaces are better when they are diverse. Society is better when we embrace diversity and we include everybody. When we allocate resources and put more resources where the greatest need is. And that's how we should function. Well, I wish you all a great day today. Continue to pay attention to what's happening in your state government. If you're in the state of Florida, you can go to the Florida channel. We're starting committee meetings. Actually, they're starting now. I'm late, so I need to log off so I can get in committee meeting. But it's been so good this morning to have you for another Real Talk. God bless you, and God bless America.